Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I'm pleased to be with you today and have the chance to introduce our next speaker in the Empire Lecture Series, Jennifer Hochschild. My name is Adam Levine. I'm an assistant professor of government at Cornell University. And I'm particularly thrilled to be here to introduce Professor Hochschild because her book, What's Fair, was one of the very earliest introductions to political science I ever had as an undergraduate. So it's quite an honor to be able to introduce you this morning. Hochschild is the Henry Labar Jane Professor of Government at Harvard University, Professor of African and African American Studies, and Harvard College Professor. She holds lectureships, in the Harvard Kennedy School and the Harvard Graduate School of Business. Education. In 2011, she held the John W. Kluge Chair in American Law and Governance at the Library of Congress. She is currently President-elect 2014 to 2015 of the American Political Science Association and will assume the role as President in September. Her topic today is the politics of genomics, liberals' war on science, ? Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Hochschild.
Thank you all for coming. I will say, unlike many, I think, of the Empire lectures, this is very, very much a work in progress, which is to say I was working on one of the slides at about 10:30 this morning. So on the one hand, there's lots and lots of open things not yet done, both in the sort of the empirical sense that we should do this or that sort of analysis, but more in the general sense of we're not really sure exactly where this project is going to end up. So this is a little bit experimental and a little bit risky perhaps, but I really wanted to talk about something that I would genuinely like some response to rather than sort of present already completed work. My other very general introductory comment is that when I say we, it's not a royal we. There is a genuine co-author here. It's Maya Sen, who's in the Harvard Kennedy School, former student and now colleague, and she's the co-PI on the project. So this is fully joint work, and lots of the arguments and evidence and so on at least come from Maya's work. So this is a project that I think is a little unusual, shall we say, in political science. As far as I know, there's one other political scientist working at this level on genomic science. We're not engaged in the issue of sort of biopolitics or genopolitics about the relationship between genes and political attitudes or political behaviors. There's a very thriving subfield or set of people working on that. Ours is a broader question of how genomic science is going to play out in the political and ideological arenas over, roughly speaking, the next 50 years or so. So I start with this quote from The Economist. I almost always start with this because I think it captures two central points that underlie the project as a whole. One is the idea that the biological sciences are to the 21st century what the physical sciences were to the 20th century. And if you think about physics in 1915, this is, of course, just at the very early stages of a huge, huge efflorescence of research, knowledge, political use, policy use. And physics basically changed the 20th century in ways that were simply unanticipatable in 1915. And that's part of what The Economist is getting at here, expectations reminiscent of the physical sciences at the beginning of the 20th century. The other thing that I think is very useful about this quote is the final phrase, which is to say, the analogy will continue for both good and ill. And the notion of both good and ill obviously is relevant to physics in the 20th century, and I think is equally relevant to biology or genomics more particularly in the 21st century. And that's part of what we're trying to capture in this project of for whom will it be good or ill, who will believe it to be good or ill, what will be the relationship between the actual benefits and harms and the politics or ideology around the benefits and harms. So we start with a question of kind of what are the political analogies? How do we think about genomics in the political or public arena? If you think about it in the medical arena, President Obama talked about precision medicine in his State of the Union address, the idea that we can actually genomically sequence each person's individual cancer tumor and give them the right medication. We no longer have to use this very crude distinction between lung cancer and stomach cancer and so on. That medicine will have huge benefits as a consequence of genomics. The other flip side of that argument is, again, this quote comes from one of my early interviews, the long tail of genomics is eugenics, that we're basically reinventing eugenics science, in scare quotes here, because of the dangers of associating good people and bad people with good genes and bad genes. Perhaps there's a racial component. We all kind of know the history of eugenics, and so the association of biology with human capacity or human abilities or human behaviors is extremely dangerous and very scary. Second pair of analogies is in the legal arena. As many of you probably know, the FBI has about 10, 11 million DNA samples in the national database called CODIS. They are disproportionately, these come from people who have been convicted of felonies, and increasingly people arrested for felonies, even arrested for misdemeanors. If you think about what we know about the criminal justice system, it's not surprising that these are very disproportionately male. They're disproportionately black. They're disproportionately young, disproportionately poor. They're also disproportionately Latino because immigrants subject to deportation are also sampled, their DNA is sampled. So one argument is that genomics in the legal arena is simply recreating Jim Crow in a new kind of technological surveillance. The flip side of that is the Innocence Project, which has now been responsible for the release of roughly 300 people who were falsely convicted, typically of terrible felonies. And almost all cases, it was through DNA testing, which proved that they were not, in fact, guilty. So the Innocence Project is arguing that we actually need more expansive, more system-wide, more population-wide, perhaps, genomic testing in order to avoid false convictions or release people who are falsely convicted. So again, very different politics within the legal arena. The third analogy, the genome huggers phrase also should be in quotes here, comes from one of my interviews. The idea that sort of on the left, don't mess with nature. Resistance to genetically modified foods or organisms, fear of sort of human overweening impulse to control the natural order, which is going to be very, very dangerous. The banging down the doors to the lab, again, is the flip side of that political argument about sort of the role of genomic science in understanding and perhaps even controlling nature. This is a quote from Mary Claire King, who's describing her postdocs, who are so excited about what the science is producing that they're banging down the doors to her lab at 7 in the morning. And she says, you know, I'm a little older than that. I don't really want to be there at 7. But there's a tremendous excitement about what we can learn about nature, which simply has never been available to us. The final pair of analogies here is in the racial arena, which is how I got into this project some years ago. The idea it's a small world after all, that if we actually do racial ancestry testing or we understand the, quote, racial, again, scare quotes here because I'm going to talk about that later, we'll discover that many, many, many of us have a much more mixed biogeographical ancestry or heritage than we thought we did, and we will discover that, in fact, what we think of as racial boundaries are simply false at the level of genes and therefore, by implication, false at the level of society. The flip side of that analogy is the fear of inscribing race into genetic material. This is a paraphrase from Diana Fulwiley especially, but there's a lot of people who make the same argument, that what we're doing is reinscribing race. We're deepening and sharpening and heightening the false notion that there is a genuine distinction between one race and another, and when we move it into the realm of biology and genes, it's really, really scary. So there's a lot of sort of within the advocacy or expert or engaged community, there are a variety of very distinct, contradictory, mutually hostile understandings of what genomics is going to do in the public arena over the 21st century. Then there's the argument that there's actually no politics here. This quote comes from an interview that I did with a federal official very early in the project, and it was actually a terrible interview, and I couldn't understand why. I could not get him to talk about the issues that I wanted him to talk about. This is a person with deep expertise in genetics who is deeply embedded in the federal government, and he insisted that his job has nothing to do with politics. There are legal, social, ethical issues, but no partisan dynamics. I don't have partisan conversations. My assistant has to remind me of whether I'm talking to a Republican or a Democrat when I go up to the Hill. I walked out of the interview thinking that I had failed as an interviewer, but on reflection, I think this is actually quite a useful perspective on, I'm a scientist, there's no politics here, even though I work at a fairly high level in the federal government. So a core foundational question for the whole project is, are there any politics in this? As a political scientist, I want to insist, of course there are. But more interestingly, what are the politics and how do they vary across the various components of genomic science? So we argue that there's actually two fundamental dimensions that have political valence or will have political ideological valence as this moves further and further into both the political arenas and the public arenas. And I want to kind of talk through each of those dimensions first and then put them together, not surprisingly, if I have two dimensions into a 2x2 table, and then talk through what kind of the political implications are of that. So one dimension is genetic fundamentalism as compared with something like social construction or environmental construction or individual free will. The term genetic fundamentalism isn't really terribly good. I've sometimes used determinism or penetrance or sort of genetic stuff matters is really what this is trying to get at. Again, comes a quote here from one of the interviews: "The role of environment in crime is oversold by social scientists." Slightly more formal definition: important human phenotypes are caused or at least significantly shaped by genetic inheritance. Most people who make this argument focus on the significantly shaped rather than in a simple causal model. The flip side of that is an environmental determinism or perhaps social construction. There's a complexity here whether the flip side is free will. I'll come back to that at the very end, but I'm kind of bracketing that at the moment because it's too complicated for me to figure out. So thoughts about that would be helpful. Again, a quotation from one of our interviews: "The disproportionate attention to genomics at the expense of studying sort of social causes of disease, radioactive waste seeping into the groundwater, or the health consequences of stress, obesity, lack of public transportation, and so on." So if we focus on genetic or genomic causes of disease, we won't focus sufficiently on the environmental or social causes. So that's one dimension. More formally, that human phenotypes are caused or shaped by socialization through societal forces, not by genetic forces. And in particular, since my work comes out of the field of race and ethnic politics, race as a concept and racial boundaries are societally constructed. There is no biology here. The other dimension is technology optimism, and you'll soon discover technology pessimism as sort of the alternative to it. Humankind's on the verge of transformation. The genome is driving the change. More formally, a technology, this is sort of risk-seeking as compared with risk aversion or preference for type 1 rather than type 2 errors. I can never remember which is which, but you get the general point. Centered on advancement concern, motivations for attaining growth, eager strategies for seeking gains, even recognizing and accepting the risk of committing errors or some sort of losses. So technology optimism. Technology is going to benefit society even though there will be bumps along the way, and we have to accept the bumps in order to get the benefits. Flip side of that is technology pessimism about genomics. It exacerbates long-standing inequities. What types of people get to be the knowing inquirers? That's presumably the scientists, the elites, like the people in this room. Which people are asked to offer their bodies or their biological material as a raw material for scientific research that will not benefit them. So genomics will reinforce long-standing societal inequalities rather than offsetting them. Again, to put it more formally, this is the flip side of technology optimism. It's a quote from the same article: focused on security concerns, strategies of protecting against possible losses, even at the risk of missing opportunities for gain. So we want to protect against the worst outcomes, even though we might lose something that would benefit us, as compared with promoting the best outcomes, even at the risk of harming a few people somewhere along the way. So these are sort of analytic continua. You can find kind of examples of them not only in my interviews, but sort of out there in the world pretty readily. So one logic is that these are politically constructed. I'm using simple kind of left-right continua distinction here. I'm going to complicate that in a few minutes. That conservatives typically think there is a biological component to many phenotypes. Race has a biological element, intelligence, aggression, variety of diseases. It's an interesting contradiction within both the left and the right. The right wants to argue that sexual orientation is not biological, but there is a general willingness to agree that there is some biological components to a lot of sort of human behaviors and phenotypes. And the left, liberals, are roughly speaking the opposite. Most phenotypes are socially constructed, certainly race, certainly intelligence, or environmentally determined. Again, I'm using kind of socially constructed and environmentally determined roughly as synonyms here because I'm moving through a lot of things fairly quickly. They have the opposite view on sexual orientation, but roughly speaking, conservatives accept biological components. Liberals or the left are quite fearful and nervous about them. So there's a political story there. Similarly, on technology optimism and pessimism, the conventional wisdom of conservatives are pessimists in technological science terms. They're anti-science. There's a book called The Republican War on Science. Liberals are optimists and pro-science, kind of the theoretical underpinnings here from Albert Hirschman's book, The Rhetoric of Reaction. Be happy to talk about that because I think it's a wonderful book, but I'll spare you the details on that now. The graph here is simply a GSS, this kind of the standard GSS question about a great deal of confidence. And what you see is that there was no ideological or political division up through, roughly speaking, the early 1990s. And then sometime in the mid-1990s up to the present, the question of sort of pro-science versus anti-science in this very general term becomes partisan or ideological division. I couldn't resist. Everybody probably is Senator Jim Imhofe, who is the chair of the Committee on Environment and Public Works, not an unimportant scientific committee, brought a snowball into the Senate floor a couple weeks ago to demonstrate that global warming isn't really occurring, and he threw the snowball to the person sitting in the chair of the Senate. And he's obviously not a big fan of the scientific research on global warming. All the hysteria, phony science, it's the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. God is still there. The arrogance to think that we would be able to change what he is doing to the climate is, to me, outrageous. And you can find lots of sort of parallel quotes. Many of them from him, but not uniquely from him. So one way of putting these two dimensions together that I talked about and put them in political terms is that essentially the simple starting point is that the right, broadly defined, are genetic determinists, or at least recognize a genetic component to human phenotypes, and they're technology pessimists, they're anti-science. And the left is the opposite. They're social constructivists or environmental determinists, and they're pro-science. And the two diagonals are a little more complicated. I'll talk about them in a few minutes. So that's the starting point. That's the sort of the simple construction of where the politics and ideology around genomic science are going to take us. I don't think that's wrong, but I think it's too simple. So I think it's sometimes wrong, and there's three bits of evidence that I'll walk through fairly quickly to show why that typology, keep that in mind, is a little bit too simple. So the first is there has been a grand total of, as far as I know, one piece of legislation at the national level. There are a few more at the state levels. This is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, passed in 2008. It prohibits the use of the parentheses quote of most are my gloss. In principle, the law prohibits the use of genetic information in health insurance and employment. Senator Kennedy described this as the first major new civil rights bill of the new century. It passed the Senate 95-0, the House of Representatives at 414-1. I can't think of almost any other piece of legislation in this highly polarized environment in Congress that has that sort of voting record. So there was not an ideological or partisan division around the sole piece of federal legislation. Second bit of evidence that the starting typology is too simplistic. This is a piece of research that we did in which we found the 640. That wasn't the number we were aimed at. That's the number that we arrived at. Most cited articles in the 10 highest impact journals in 13 social science disciplines. And we used 2 citation counts. Again, I can explain more about the details of this later, but I want to kind of give the big picture here. We'd had coding, many articles. It was basically, we asked our coders to give us whether the overall valence of the article was essentially technology optimistic around genomics or technologically pessimistic around genomics. We had a series of more specific codes as we went along, but this was kind of the crucial point for today's purposes. Most of the articles were coded as neutral in a way that my co-author and I would have probably coded them as having a valence because we had very cautious coders. They didn't know what we were doing, which is what we wanted, but they also didn't know anything about genomics. So they weren't reading between the lines. They were reading for explicit statements of this is a good thing, this is a bad thing. However, if you set aside the ones, the majority that were coded as neutral, what you come out with is demonstrable differences within the social sciences. Criminology, economics, psychology, political science, physical anthropology, a majority of those coded as having a valence were coded as optimistic about, technologically optimistic about genomic science. Two of the social sciences were coded as entirely pessimistic. There were no articles in either racial and ethnic studies or cultural studies that had anything positive to say about genomic science. And then there were a variety that were sort of mixed. So if you look at kind of the elite discourse within the academy, you don't see the left being technologically optimistic if you assume that racial and ethnic studies and cultural studies are sort of the most left disciplines. Again, there's some research evidence, but I don't think that's a terribly controversial statement. The social science disciplines that are either more mixed or less ideologically identifiable were relatively more positive. So point number two is that within the elite scholarship, you don't see the left being technologically optimistic and the right being technologically pessimistic. It's either much more mixed or the most left social science disciplines are the most technologically pessimistic about genomics. Evidence number three, I'll spend a little more time on that, is our survey. We were funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and Maya and I conducted a 20-minute online survey. We had about 4,200 respondents stratified by race and ethnicity. So if you just think of kind of the four big groups, black, white, Asian, Latino, we identified Latinos separately. So these are non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks, and so on, conducted by Knowledge Networks. So technology, optimism, and pessimism. We identified for our respondents what a medical biobank and what a legal biobank. We described them and explained them in terms that would, we hope, make sense to people who are not experts in this field. Do you think the use of DNA samples for either medical or scientific research, and then as a separate question for law enforcement, are likely to do more good than harm to society? The alternative response categories were more harm than good or equal amounts of good and harm. And again, not terribly surprisingly, a plurality chose the middle category. Thank you. But what you see is that Republicans are more likely to endorse legal or forensic biobanks. Democrats are more likely to endorse medical scientific biobanks. So again, there's not a kind of a simple division between the left says good and the right says bad. It depends a lot on within genomic science. We have other examples of the same kinds of questions. Again, I can talk more about those later, but I'm trying to kind of give a very big picture overview. Finally, we looked at a question, or finally for purposes, for immediate purposes, at the question of genetic inheritance of various kinds of human phenotypes. This question's worded a little awkwardly. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to ask about whether things have genetic inheritance in a way that survey respondents could actually make sense of. So it's some things about a person are caused all or mostly by their genes. Others are due to their environment or the way they live. I think in a subsequent survey we want to separate out environment from the way they live because those are actually ideologically quite distinct, but we didn't for this purposes. We gave them 8 phenotypes. These were randomly ordered within the survey itself, ranging from things that we assumed many people would say are genetic, sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, eye color, to at least one thing that we assume people would say is not genetic, which is to say the flu. And what we found lots of things, but there's basically no partisan difference here between things that people assumed were genetic and people, or responded were genetic, and things that people responded were not genetic. Almost nobody said the flu was genetic, which is reassuring. For all of these items, with the exception of being gay and lesbian, there's essentially no difference. There's 2 or 3 point difference between Democrats and Republicans. None of these are statistically significant differences. So again, there's no partisan difference between people's understanding of genetic inheritance at the level of individuals and non-genetic inheritance. In sum, liberalism does not always imply greater technology optimism in the kind of the language of the Republican war on science might lead you to expect. And liberalism does not always imply the rejection of biological inheritance in a way that the language of social construction or environmental determinism would expect you to lead you to expect. So we have a somewhat more complicated typology, which is roughly speaking, the world's complicated. We think that sort of the dominant tendency of the right to be in the upper left and the left to be in the bottom right, if that sentence made sense. Cell 1 is mostly the right and cell 4 is mostly the left, but at least three of the 4 cells seems to be much more ideologically complicated than we anticipated or than one might anticipate from reading sort of the broader literature about social construction, environmental determinism on the one hand, and biological causes of human phenotypes on the other. So that's kind of where we are at this point in the project. That's a little vague, but we actually have, there's some more evidence behind it. I've only shown you kind of snippets of it. And mostly what we're trying to do is figure out whether this typology is actually right, which I'm pretty sure it is. And more interesting, what's going on behind it, because saying, well, it's mostly right-wing but a little bit left-wing isn't a terribly interesting or profound political conclusion. So the next stage of the project is kind of what's going on. Why is there this somewhat more mixed ideological valence around genomic science than one might initially have expected? We see just some evidence for the more complexity, the greater complexity in that typology. There's two things. One, we see some unlikely ideological pairings, and I have to point out that Maya was the one who identified this. I completely went past me. She was looking much more carefully at the evidence than I was. But if you look at the use of DNA databases in the criminal justice system, it's forensic databases, or forensic biobanks, does more good than harm to society. Do you think these things are a good idea? What you see is majority support in the population as a whole. Not a great deal of difference between liberals and conservatives, with one exception that I'll get to in a second. Liberals are slightly more skeptical, but a majority of liberals support forensic biobanks. Look at the extreme conservatives. My slides actually had that in bright red, but you can't. So extreme conservatives are hostile, or more hostile than any other group, to forensic biobanks. We interpret that, although the evidence, we don't have it clearly in the survey, as these are libertarians. Forensic biobanks make them very nervous. Look at the racial and ethnic column on the right-hand side. What you see is a little more bouncing around. Latinos are a little uncertain about this. But the big hostility or the big difference is between blacks and everybody else. So what you have is a kind of ideological pairing of extreme conservatives who are presumably, we infer, libertarians concerned about privacy, and African Americans who are concerned about the forensic biobanks for reasons of the Jim Crow surveillance. Thank you. Here's another way in which the conventional ideological arguments don't make sense, which is the lack of partisan polarization in some cases. I showed you before evidence that there's no partisan differences on individual genetic inheritance except for social orientation. That was a slide I showed you a few minutes ago. We asked a parallel question about whether there's a racial component to genetic inheritance, whether genetic inheritance comes through, we left it a little vague, race or ethnicity. So whether phenotypes are more highly prevalent in one group due to genetic factors. That's not the language that we used in the survey. We just said sort of coming through race and ethnicity. And it turns out there are no partisan differences even on that somewhat more loaded question. So there it is. That's a sort of a summary measure of whether there are racially inflected genetic inheritances across those 8 items that I showed you a while ago. And what you see is that Democrats and Republicans are essentially in exactly the same place. Again, I can tell you more detail kind of what lies behind this. There's also not very much racial difference. Blacks are a little less likely to say that a variety of phenotypes are inherited through race or ethnicity, but not much less likely to say so. These are actually not statistically significant differences across race, and they certainly aren't across partisanship. So, why do we see this much more complicated ideological story than we started out with in the initial framing of the typology? We're going to do the kind of standard regressions, is this about education? Is this about scientific literacy? And the answer is yes, those things matter. But what we're more interested in is kind of the way that genomics will play out in the political arena. So we're more interested in the kind of why do people hold ideologically complicated views rather than can we explain these views away through controlling for X or Y. So we're seeking substantive explanations. And I will point out, before I move into those in my last couple of minutes, that when you actually stop and think about it, the notion that liberals are pro-science and conservatives are anti-science just doesn't work very well. The big things that we're most aware of, evolutionary theory, climate control, stem cell research, that's true. Liberals are kind of believe that evolutionary theory matters, conservatives tend not to. But if you look at a bunch of other scientific arenas, the conservatives or the right are more sort of pro-technology. Nuclear power for generating energy, fracking, drones, genetically modified food. There's lots of survey data and there's kind of advocacy data that says actually the basic distinction between pro and anti-science, left and right, doesn't work very well. It depends a lot on what kind of science, which kind of reinforces the question of what underlies ideological framings around genomics in particular, but science policy more generally. So one answer is privacy concerns. I flagged that a few minutes ago when I talked about the libertarians, or at least the extreme conservatives and blacks being the most concerned about forensic DNA databases. This is Maryland v. King, was a decision, Supreme Court decision in 2013, agreeing that the state may collect DNA from arrestees, which of course will vastly increase the number of people in local, state, and federal forensic databases. Who dissented from this? Justices Scalia, Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Kagan. That's not a usual dissent in a 5-4 decision. I'm actually looking to see, there's a few other cases in which that combination of 4 dissenters occurred, but very few, and they almost all revolve around this privacy issue. And there's, of course, as usual, a wonderful quote from Scalia, who's rhetorically the most elegant Supreme Court justice. Second reason for this ideological complexity is not privacy per se, but kind of too much reliance on science. Again, these are 2 GSS questions, and the basic point is that in both of them, extreme conservatives and extreme liberals resemble each other more or less, whereas sort of other kinds of conservatives and other kinds of liberals are closer to each other. So this kind of U-shaped curve around the question of genetically modified food and kind of believing too much in science. So that the strong left and the strong right are converging, at least on these items. The third is I talked about a minute ago, so I'll just remind you of this, that genetic explanations for phenotypes don't map neatly onto ideology. People on the left see some underlying biological or genetic explanations for some phenotypes. People on the right see underlying biological or genetic explanations for other phenotypes. So that simple division doesn't work very well, and we're picking that up, I think, in the genomics arena. Fourth is a division within the left on whether genomics should in fact be thought of as colorblind, whether it's dangerous to inscribe race in the genes. And Rena Bliss has a wonderful book in which she's basically identifying racially conscious, racially identified geneticists who say we have to think about the role of genomics in race, to ignore the racial or biogeographical components in genomics is just as bad as sort of color blindness broadly across the society. So they're clearly identified with the left, they're racially identified. They say we need to pay attention to the relationship between genomics and race. And of course, the flip side of that is the Dorothy Roberts, that this is really, really, really dangerous, that identifying identity in genetic terms creates a biological essentialism. So the left is split. Finally, the right is split to the degree that there's a religious story here, and again, I haven't talked about that part of the survey, but I can get back to that, is that some people on the right believe that prenatal testing in particular, but more broadly genomic science in general, is deeply dangerous. Prenatal testing is eugenics. It violates God's law. There are some church positions, Catholic Church and other religious positions on anxiety about, if not hostility to prenatal testing. Conversely, I don't know if Francis Collins would identify as being on the right, but at least for current purposes, I'm using him, putting him there. If we turn our back on science, will we turn our back on science? The God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. There is no contradiction between religion and science, he would argue. So I will conclude with the question is there politics in genomic science? The answer is yes. It isn't playing out in the public arena yet, but it's there in the advocacy groups, it's there in the elite scholarly discourse, and we believe it's there underlyingly in the actual way in which genomics will play out socially. And sooner or later, the public's going to learn about this. I can talk a little bit about how we think that might occur, but I'll save that for later. So, many thanks to Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in particular, but other people in general. Thank you. Close. So we have a microphone here, and I would love to have questions or comments or advice on how to proceed with this project, because as I say, we're still kind of in the early stages of it.
All right, so I will bring the microphone to the questioners, if you would. I saw your hand first, so you got the first question.
Great, thanks.
Also introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Morgan Marietta from UMass Lowell. Jennifer, I wanted to ask you how you think of this work in genomics and attitudes towards science, how it relates to your other recent work in terms of facts. I just read Do Facts Matter? And I've been wrestling with this question myself of what you can call information versus misinformation, when you can say that someone has the right fact or not the right fact. So if you take this and apply it to that idea, in terms of attitudes towards science, like take fracking, for example, that the right tends to say is correct and the left tends to say is not. Do you feel comfortable saying you can tell which one about genomics and attitudes towards science? Is an attitude toward pro-science the same thing as saying information and anti-science is misinformation? Or about, say, fracking, can we say that one is true or false? Or in regard to, say, GMOs, one is true or false? Or how do you think the whole pro-science question relates to the information-misinformation question?
It's a great question. I ought to have a well-developed answer. It turns out my own work is a little schizophrenic, which is to say I haven't actually thought about this project in relation to that book that I just published, so I should do so. I think I think it's too simple to say that sort of being pro-genomics would be pro-science, it would be factually correct, and being anti-science is misinformation or factually incorrect. I did interview one of the geneticists that I've interviewed. So this project's kind of in the middle of that question, and I don't have a fully developed answer. One of the geneticists I interviewed said, I like data. True data are true. And that's actually going to be, floating somewhere around in this argument. So one version of, for example, the race-positive genomics is exactly the argument that there really are, if you don't call it race, you can call it biogeographical ancestry. There really are identifiable genomic clusters, particular sets of alleles that map pretty closely onto geographical regions that we have traditionally identified as being white or black or Asian or something like that. And that's true science. And we need to engage with it. And people who are sort of radically social or strongly socially constructivist are simply either misinformed or are being driven by their partisan or ideological views. So there is a nice, simple mapping of correct information as compared with misinformation on the recognition that race is genomically, there is a biology to race in some fashion or other as compared with the rejection of that. The flip side, the social constructivists, of course, are saying exactly the opposite, which is that it's misinformation to ascribe anything that even moves in the direction of sounding like race to the gene. The gene has no race. And that's misinformation. It's applying a level of sort of social, it's social invention onto something that it's false information, it's misinformation, it's its own ideological construction. The correct fact is that there is no such thing as a biology of race, and it's deeply dangerous. I think and you can tell the same story in the legal arena or in the medical arena, right? You can go through the same kind of parallelism. I think I tend to come down more on the side of the geneticists, which is to say true facts are true. And that there's something, and I think part of what's driving me to do this project is that if we agree, if we admit, if we accept, maybe a better term, that there is a genuine informational content in genomics that violates our historical treatment of, again, race is the sort of the clearest example, our historical understanding of how dangerous it is to associate biology with race. We need to come to grips with that. We need to accept that as sort of genuine scientific information, at least at the level of genomics as it's currently developed. 50 years from now, this all may look totally silly. And figure out politically how to engage with that information rather than either denying and running away from it, and certainly rather than allowing ourselves to kind of slip back into old constructions about the way in which, for example, biology and race are linked. So my starting premise is probably that the genomicists have the right information and the political arena is distorting it for our own sort of social and political purposes. But I'm not sure how far down that road I'm prepared to go. So that's not really a very clear and definite answer. As I say, I tend to start by assuming that the scientists are right, at least in a narrow sense. But as you know, the way in which sort of correct information gets used in the political arena can be deeply, deeply, not only distorted, but also deeply dangerous.
We have time for one more question. I think I saw your hand second.
Thank you very much. I'm Alex Opria from Duke. I loved your talk, and I was fascinated by how much agreement actually you see and how much nonpartisanship perhaps is present. And I was wondering whether you think education might be the level at which the battle can turn really political, because I'm thinking about issues like evolution and climate change, sex education. It might be that adults in the liberal sphere might be willing to tolerate a little diversity, but when it comes down to what are we going to teach in schools, is it going to be the more genetically determinist, is it going to be the more socially constructive? It feels like that's potentially very explosive politically. And so I'm wondering where you see genetics sort of making its way through the schools, whether you think of that as a channel.
It's hugely explosive politically. You're exactly right. The first thing I will say is simply that the old literature on scientific literacy is clearly right. The more people know about, we have a series of questions about, where does DNA appear in the body? Do blacks and whites share DNA? Do mouse and humans share DNA? The more people are correct in their, again, narrowly defined understanding of DNA, the more technologically optimistic they are about this arena. So again, you can kind of explain away some of the racial differences by either broadly education or particularly scientific literacy. No surprise there, and the causal story is hopelessly conflated and so on. The question of how this is going to get used in the schools, I think there are two answers that I would like to see, quite different from what I actually anticipate. One is a very strong historical understanding of the danger, so the way in which racial science has developed in the United States, or maybe in the West, maybe in the world as a whole. So, sort of a historical knowledge about the old 19th century racial science, about the development of eugenics as a perfectly legitimate and high status understanding in the 1920s, and then its transformation in the 1930s and 40s, so that the children, and people don't know that, a lot of school children just aren't taught that history. It's a shameful, embarrassing history. So a clearer understanding of why it is that association between race and biology is really, really, really scary. You could tell the same story, again, in the medical arena or in the legal arena. There's a history behind the anxiety and the fears of linking biology to medicine, to medical treatment, to medical diagnosis, and so on. So I would like the education system to kind of teach people that it's not crazy to be really nervous about this. There really are potentially deep dangers, and our history gives us no reason to believe that the optimistic story is what's going to play out. Having said that, I also think that people have got to have, children, but adults, a much more sophisticated understanding of biology and the capacity at least to distinguish between a gene and a chromosome, to know when you say something like different alleles or allele constructions, or without using the jargon, that sort of, genetics, fundamental knowledge about genetics, I guess, is what I think. And again, if the analogy with 20th century physics is right, this is going to be all over the place over the next generation or two. And if the public has really no knowledge of genetics, genetic science from high school biology or college biology, then it's going to be very easy to distort it in either one direction or the other. Juvenile delinquency is caused by bad genes, right? Or genes have absolutely nothing to do with intelligence, aggression, heart disease, sexual orientation, addiction, obesity, whatever, the thing. Both of those are wrong, but the capacity to understand why there might be a genetic component to some behavior or phenotype, but that's not in any remotely way socially deterministic. There are choices we can make as a political, as a polity. There are different policy options. So yes, it matters, but it's not remotely deterministic. For people to hold both of those views simultaneously, I think there's got to be a level of educational awareness that makes that sentence make sense. So I think we need a lot more historical awareness of why this is potentially very dangerous. So the negative side is real and is important, and that's our history. But there are genuine scientific concepts and precepts that would enable us to kind of take advantage of what biology is teaching us, but to recognize that there are real policy choices. You know, suppose we discover that there was a genetic component to aggressiveness, right, which the geneticists say there is. There's an array of policy things that we could do. One is lock these kids up really early because they're really dangerous and there's not much we're going to be. The other is, you know, further kinds of educational resources or social resources or something, something, something. And these are real choices. There's not sort of biology isn't driving the outcome. It's a long answer. And I think people need to know enough biology, to learn enough biology to not be frightened of it. Maybe that's the simplest way of answering your question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Yeah.